It's August 1987, and in a quiet Moscow street, a U.S. Embassy employee collapses from a mysterious, debilitating illness. This wasn't a random sickness, it was a symptom of a decades-long assault, an attack using a silent, invisible weapon that bathed the entire American embassy in a sea of focused radiation, leaving a legacy of cancer and confusion. And a terrifying question: what was the real purpose of the Moscow signal? The story begins in the heart of the Cold War, a period of ruthless espionage where paranoia was policy. In 1953, during a routine sweep for background radiation, U.S. technicians inside the Moscow embassy discovered something unsettling. A persistent wide-beam microwave signal was being aimed directly at the building. The source was traced to a Soviet apartment building about 100 meters away. For years, the discovery was kept secret from the public and even from most of the embassy personnel. The United States government, it seemed, was more concerned with avoiding a diplomatic incident than with the health of its own people. This silence persisted for over a decade. In the mid-1960s, a White House science advisor named Jerome Wiesner sounded an internal alarm. He wrote in a secret memo, "More effort should be made to understand the purpose of the microwave signal, or failing in this, to stop it." His warning was blunt. It is hard to understand why we have been so unconcerned about it. The bureaucracy, however, was paralyzed by indecision. His warning vanished into a void of classified memos and official inaction. Despite his plea, protective shielding for the embassy windows was not installed for another decade. The staff continued their work, oblivious to the invisible sea of energy they lived and worked in, 18 hours a day. In 1975, the situation escalated. The intensity of the beam suddenly increased, and a second signal was detected. The truth could no longer be contained. The State Department was forced to brief the staff, and the story exploded into public view. The official explanation from the Soviets was that the signal was for jamming American eavesdropping equipment. The U.S. government, in public statements, downplayed the risk, issuing fact sheets claiming there was no cause for concern. But behind the scenes, a cascade of medical horrors had already begun, a pattern of sickness too consistent to be a coincidence. The anecdotal evidence was overwhelming. Diplomats reported strange ailments, from persistent headaches and eye tics to severe fatigue and an inability to concentrate. An unusual number of employees were found to have elevated white blood cell counts. And then there were the cancer cases. A reanalysis of a 40-year-old epidemiological study found the cancer mortality rate for Moscow embassy employees was higher than that of the general population. The list of symptoms was long and terrifying: memory loss, confusion, blood disorders, paranoia. For the diplomats and their families, life in Moscow became a state of constant low-grade fear, where every headache or bout of sickness carried a sinister undertone. The embassy itself, meant to be a sovereign sanctuary, felt like a weaponized space. Trust eroded not just in their hosts, but in the very rooms they occupied. They were agitated and offended by the official denials, feeling like subjects in a grotesque, unacknowledged experiment. Lawsuits were filed against the U.S. government, but they were eventually withdrawn, with no compensation ever paid. To make the abstract horror personal, look no further than Ambassador Walter Stoessel, Jr., a respected career diplomat. In 1975, he began suffering from debilitating symptoms, including severe nausea and bleeding from his eyes. He was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder and would later die of leukemia. It was Stoessel who, upon learning the full scope of the radiation, threatened to resign unless his entire staff was informed of the danger. In a declassified phone call, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger directly linked Stoessel's illness to the microwaves, admitting the danger in a secret conversation. Even as the public was being reassured, adding a chilling instruction, "We are trying to keep the thing quiet." Stoessel was not alone. Two previous American ambassadors to Moscow, Llewellyn Thompson and Charles Bolin, had also died of cancer. For the people who served there, it was too much to be a coincidence. This brings us back to the central mystery. If the signal wasn't just for jamming, what was its true purpose? The most prominent theory, held by numerous scientists and intelligence officials, was that the Moscow signal was a form of clandestine psychoelectronic warfare. The goal was not to kill, but to degrade, to disorient, and to induce chronic stress, interfering with the decision-making capacity of American personnel. This theory was supported by the Pentagon's own secret research program, Project Pandora. Started in the 1960s, its purpose was to investigate the biological and behavioral effects of low-level microwaves, specifically in response to the Moscow signal. Declassified documents show that scientists believed the signal could affect the central nervous system, putting people to sleep or inducing a state of constant fatigue. The symptoms reported by the diplomats, headaches, confusion, memory loss, were consistent with known effects of microwave radiation on the brain. The Soviets, it was believed, were using the entire embassy staff as unwilling test subjects in a decades-long experiment in mind control. The objective was strategic attrition, to create an embassy staff so riddled with sickness and paranoia that their diplomatic functions would simply crumble from within. Of course, there are counter-narratives. The official Soviet explanation remained that the beam was for jamming American surveillance equipment, and an official 1978 U.S. study concluded there were no definitive adverse health effects, a finding that many victims have fiercely disputed ever since. That study, victims pointed out, was incomplete. It failed to account for cancers and other illnesses that take years to manifest. Critics argued it was a study designed to find nothing, a classic case of bureaucratic plausible deniability. The State Department had its report. It washed its hands of the matter and moved on, even as the microwaving reportedly continued for another decade. For the diplomats who served, this felt like a profound betrayal, not just by a hostile foreign power, but by their own government, which chose diplomatic quiet over their health and safety. The legacy of the Moscow signal is not confined to the Cold War. It echoes today in the disturbing phenomenon known as Havana Syndrome. Starting in 2016, U.S. and Canadian diplomats began reporting bizarre symptoms: splitting headaches, vertigo, nausea, and cognitive difficulties, sometimes after hearing a strange clicking or buzzing sound. The parallels are undeniable. Victims of Havana Syndrome, now numbering over 200, have described a similar struggle, with a government that was initially skeptical and dismissive of their complaints. The leading theory for the cause of Havana Syndrome, according to a National Academies of Sciences report, is directed microwave energy. For the survivors of the Moscow signal, it feels like history repeating itself. A new generation of diplomats is being targeted by a silent, invisible weapon: their lives and health collateral damage in a clandestine war. The weapons may have evolved, but the terrifying principle remains the same. The real trauma of the Moscow signal is the knowledge that a nation's own people can be deemed expendable. Their suffering silenced for the sake of political expediency, leaving behind a legacy of sickness and denial. And a question that still haunts us: who is pulling the trigger now?